The public imagination is held captive by the missile, the silo door, the fiery ascent, the terminal velocity. This is a fatal miscalculation. The primary vector of a modern first strike is not kinetic. It is silent. The objective is not to vaporize a city, but to sever the adversary's nervous system. Strategic calculus has shifted. CSIS reports confirm that the highest leverage is found not in warheads, but in targeting the two pillars of Western power, undersea data cables and orbital satellites. This is the blueprint for asymmetric warfare. A state facing a solvency crisis cannot afford a sustained conventional conflict. Consider the naval expansion programs of states under severe economic pressure. A 2021 directive confirmed Pakistan's plan to expand its fleet to 50 ships, including 20 major surface combatants. This is not for conventional fleet-on-fleet engagement. RUSI analysis frames this as the acquisition of tools for deniable disruption, the capacity to threaten the arteries of global data and finance. The result is the Blind Leviathan Protocol. By cutting the cables and blinding the satellites, an inferior power creates a condition of total strategic panic. Without verified data, a superpower's command and control apparatus defaults to a launch-on warning posture, but its warning systems are now compromised. The threshold for accidental nuclear exchange becomes a mathematical certainty. The first strike isn't a missile, it's the silence that forces you to launch your own. The official narrative is a distraction. Modern warfare is not a contest of ideology. It is a brutal audit of national solvency. When a state's balance sheet collapses, its capacity to project conventional power, tanks, ships, logistics, evaporates. The kinetic cost becomes unsustainable. This initiates a solvency crisis. According to CSIS analysis, the financial drain of a protracted, unpopular war creates an existential domestic liability. The regime cannot afford the war, but it also cannot afford to lose it. The internal political cost of failure outweighs the external kinetic cost of escalation. This is the mathematical inflection point. Conventional weakness forces a systemic pivot to asymmetric doctrines. The state's nuclear arsenal is retasked. It ceases to be a deterrent of a last resort and becomes a form of high-stakes financial leverage, a tool to offset a conventional liability it can no longer afford. The result is a terrifying inversion of logic. The weaker the state becomes economically, the more likely it is to initiate a nuclear first strike. The threshold for escalation drops to near zero, because a nuclear exchange is incorrectly calculated as less costly than total economic and political collapse. This is the mathematical core of the strategic pivot. On one side, a $5 million main battle tank, a complex asset requiring immense logistical support, fuel, and trained personnel. On the other, a $500 first-person view drone with an explosive payload. Analysts at the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, have documented this catastrophic cost imbalance. The kinetic cost structure has been inverted. This is not simply a new tactic. It is the blueprint for a phenomenon known as the democratization of violence. The capability to neutralize high-value, state-owned assets is no longer the exclusive domain of solvent nation-states. It has been decentralized, handed down to non-state actors, proxies, or fiscally compromised nations for the price of consumer electronics. A nation's conventional military becomes a $5 trillion liability, vulnerable to a $50,000 swarm. Therefore, when a state enters a solvency crisis, its leadership is not choosing this path. It is being forced. It cannot sustain the operational cost of its conventional forces. The pivot to low-cost, high-lethality asymmetric systems is a mathematical certainty. The state begins to mass-produce the very tools that make its rivals' expensive platforms obsolete, because it is the only form of power projection it can still afford. This economic imperative directly lowers the threshold for kinetic action, both conventional and, ultimately, nuclear. The zones of regional instability you see are not the cause of the crisis. They are the symptom. They are designated proxy laboratories. While media outlets focus on surface-level chaos, they are intentionally obscuring the systemic function of these regions. They are staging areas, not for territorial conquest, but for strategic testing. Take the case of Pakistan. Official reports from 2021 detailed a massive naval expansion, aiming for a 50-ship fleet with 20 new major surface combatants. This conventional buildup occurs in parallel with a deepening solvency crisis, which required intervention from the IMF. This is not a contradiction. It is a mathematical certainty. The state is leveraging its last vestiges of credit to build a conventional deterrent it cannot sustain. According to analysts at CSIS, this exact scenario is the blueprint. These gray zones are used to measure the breaking point, the precise moment when the kinetic cost of conventional warfare becomes an existential liability. At that threshold, the state's strategic doctrine is forced to pivot. It abandons sustained conflict capability and accelerates its reliance on asymmetric assets. This is why internal intelligence bulletins from institutions like RUSI now flag instability in nations like South Africa or even Canada as significant. It's not about the local politics. It's about observing the decay of state capacity in real time. These are laboratories to calibrate the exact economic pressure required to lower a nation's nuclear threshold to a launch-on warning protocol. They are beta testing the end of the world. The launch-on warning protocol is not a policy of choice. It is a mathematical function of economic desperation. A state with robust solvency can afford to absorb a first strike, relying on hardened silos and submarine-based second strike capabilities. A state facing a solvency crisis cannot. It loses the capacity for sustained conventional warfare and cannot bear the kinetic cost of losing its arsenal on the ground. Its entire strategic posture is compressed into a single, fragile point: the early warning system. This creates a systemic liability. According to analysts at CSIS, hostile actors can now achieve strategic objectives without firing a single missile. A targeted cyber attack that blinds the early warning radar network forces an impossible choice. The command authority is suddenly operating with zero data integrity. This is the fog of digital war. The commander must now decide, is the blank screen a technical glitch, a deliberate cyber attack designed to sow panic, or does it mean the radar arrays have already been destroyed by a hypersonic first strike that is seconds from impact? Waiting for verification is a gamble that risks total annihilation. Launching based on the absence of data risks global escalation over a phantom threat. The economic decline has already made the decision for them. By stripping away conventional options, the solvency crisis has lowered the nuclear threshold to a hair trigger. The cyber attack is simply the vector that exploits the vulnerability. The launch is no longer contingent on detecting an attack, but on the terror of not being able to detect one. That is the new asymmetric battlefield. The equation is immutable. When a state's solvency is breached, its capacity for sustained conventional warfare evaporates. Grand strategic plans, such as the Pakistan Navy's ambition for a 50-ship fleet, become mathematical liabilities, not assets. According to defense analyst Zarvan Ali, the plan includes 20 major surface combatants, an immense kinetic cost for an economy under perpetual IMF-level stress, as documented by CSIS. This forces a systemic pivot. The state must trade expensive kinetic hardware for cheap asymmetric leverage. The threshold for a first strike is not a moral line. It is a financial calculation. To offset the conventional liability, the doctrine must shift to launch-on warning, or, more critically, preemptive non-kinetic action. A test is required to signal this new protocol without triggering open conflict. A calibration shot. Within the next 12 months, anticipate a full-spectrum digital blackout targeting the port logistics of a major Indian Ocean commercial hub. Crane automation, container tracking, customs clearance, all will cease. It will be attributed to state-sponsored ransomware or critical infrastructure failure. It will not be an act of war. It will be an announcement.